Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Today, we're diving into a subject that is increasingly vital for firefighters and frontline responders to really get a grip of. Today, we're talking about hazardous materials, detection technology, and how it's reshaping our work in the fire and rescue services. Joining me today is Dr. Mark Norman. Mark is a senior field application scientist at 908 Devices and a leading subject matter expert in optical detection technologies. With over 20 years of experience in hazmat detection systems for emergency response, Mark brings both scientific expertise and real-world insights. He holds a Ph.D. in Analytical Chemistry from UNC-Chapel Hill, and he's authored peer-reviewed publications, including a 2003 collaboration with NASA climatologists, and is an inventor of 2 patents related to hazardous gas and vapor identification. In our conversation, we're going to talk about the evolution of detection technology from lab-based instruments to field-deployable units, and the shift that happened post 9/11 when incidents like anthrax letters drove new levels of investment and innovation. We're also going to unpack common hazmat misconceptions. The difference between gases and vapors is one example, acute versus chronic exposures, and why understanding things like molecular weight and vapor density can quite literally save lives on the fireground. My hope, coming away from this episode, it's going to give you a clearer understanding of how to approach hazmat incidents more confidently, why good detection equipment matters, and how new threats like EV battery fires and fentanyl contamination are pushing the sector to adapt fast. So if you're a firefighter, incident commander, hazmat operator, or someone who just wants to get a deeper understanding and operational awareness in this subject, this episode is packed with practical, relevant insights that will help you do the job better and safer. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, Dr. Mark Norman. I'll see you on the other side. How has hazmat detection evolved in the 20-something years that you've been involved with it? You know, what sort of shifts have been the biggest impact on responder safety that you've seen?
In general, it's really the evolution of getting high technology into the hands of responders. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved in this process since the start of my career. So we got to go back to really the start of the century, 2000. So I started with a company called Sensor Technologies, Sense-IR is how it was spelled. And that was a group of very talented scientists, engineers, and business people. They had the world's first portable infrared system for identifying solids and liquids. Okay.
Nice.
Now, they didn't really have a market for it. So I was hired fresh out of grad school as an application scientist to say, hey, Mark, go and see, who might want to use this in the field.
I always thought a lot of this came from the military, because a lot of stuff tends to come from military investment, and then the rest of the sectors get the filter down will this be useful to you as an additional market? Military tended, in my very limited knowledge, drive a lot of R&D.
They do, and that does happen. But in the hazmat world, the tools that had been used since really the development of hazmat going back to the 70s were tools that weren't designed for hazmat. So these are things for like mine safety applications.
I was going to say, mines rescue was where my mind went. The whole canary down the mine has to have had a shelf life on its reliability.
Exactly. So the electronic canary, as it were.
Yeah.
And so as hazmat started to evolve, they said, okay, what tools are out there? And, typical hazmat are your overturned, tanker cars, your spills, things of that nature. So hazmat evolved, and even some wet chemistry where you basically take an unknown chemical and mix it with another chemical and see if it turns a certain color. I mean, that also was developed and is very useful in terms of qualitative analysis. But, the tools were sort of limited to that space. Now, again, going back to 2000, this infrared system, this laboratory technology that can identify tens of thousands of compounds. But it wasn't until after the anthrax attacks and the subsequent white powder scares that followed 9/11 that inundated hazmat teams all over the world. There became a need for something to identify these unknown powders very quickly and reliably. So the technology was there, but here is the key, Pete. It's the money. So how do you afford this, tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment without grant funding? So again, in the wake of 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, the U.S. government started just flooding the civil side of the house versus the military with these funds to make these things available. And so that's where we started to see this introduction of high technologies into the hands of civil responders. Yes, military responders, there's a lot of development on the government side to equip those soldiers and warfighters, but primarily for chemical warfare agents, when they're in theater to protect themselves from that, not from white powders.
No, that's what I was about to say, because when we think of hazardous materials, most people think of this cartoon-like green slime coming out of a barrel. Air detection, as silly as it sounds, because we are, I'm going just to zoom it back into firefighters, we're dealing with fire. We always say fire doesn't kill people, smoke does. And then again, there's very, very, very small but simplistic analogy for a second.
Right.
We never really gave a great deal. It's almost like the obvious versus the oblivious. Like, we knew the smoke was the dangerous thing, but we didn't seem to expand that mindset out for a long time into the understanding that what we're talking about is toxicology, and we're talking about toxic fumes, we're talking about aerospiral atmospheres, and continuing to follow that thought thread into, are we appropriately equipped for detection, identification, monitoring, personal protective equipment, respirators, what size of particulate is it, and what does this protect from? Is it gas tight suit? Is it this? Is it that? I've really only seen the real proliferation of this since some of the terrorist attacks, probably 15 years ago. Is we talking now? Yeah, a little bit longer than 15 years ago. So when you first got into the sector and you started to see the more broader use of this, how long down that thread did you see an appetite grow from a fire and rescue service? Because again, chemical incidents was something we would always attend, but kind of as we think you should be here because you're a public servant. It didn't really sit for the longest time, in my limited interpretation, of which bucket it sat in. Is it military? Is it police? Is it fire? It's obviously not medical, although they would deal with the aftermath of a spill or of an infection or of a contamination, if it contained people. And then obviously, I would have thought the Environment Agency as well, certainly in the UK, were probably some of the ones that were raising the alarm bells sooner, because whilst we deal with something in a closed loop over a few days, they're dealing with the tremendous after effects of, the effect it has on local water resources, where that cloud of vapor has gone. Well, it was lighter than air initially, but has it gone fully to atmosphere, or where is that? Certainly when it's something that's heavier than air, where is that going to subside? Where is it going to sit in the local, rural elements? So when did you start seeing it more heavily adopted? And I'll be totally transparent. We've had very, very limited training. This was another reason that I had, Andy Starnes, thermography expert from the US.
I don't know that name.
Anyway, he's an expert in thermography, goes around the US and around the world teaching how to use thermal imaging cameras. Because again, thermography itself is a science, and we get less than 40 minutes of training on thermal imaging cameras as an example. Makes me think about how little training we get on gas detection. And ultimately, that's the thing that's going to kill you a lot sooner than everything else. And also, we don't actually test people's sense of smell, just as a random aside. Again, sorry for this, perhaps might seem like silly, facetious rabbit hole, but we do say, you go to a carbon monoxide leak or something like that, someone that's leaking gas from a property, and we go in and go, you do that. And you go, can anybody smell anything? Why? Have you had your smell tested, Mark? Was that part of your entry selection criteria? No, it wasn't. Yeah. So why are we relying on that? Let's get an actual calibrated, researched, purpose-built piece of material. Sorry, there is a question in and amongst that somewhere, but when did you see the heavier adoption of this sort of stuff? This episode is brought to you in partnership with Godiva Limited. Godiva is one of the world's leading providers of specialist equipment for emergency services market. Godiva produces a comprehensive range of fire pumps, including vehicle-mounted, portable, and their cutting-edge integrated total water flow control system, SAMFlows. I've been using Godiva my entire career as a reliable pump on the fireground. It is such a crucial element of a successful firefighting team that you want to empower your crews with the very best, reliable, quality product. Reach out to our partners by checking the notes in the podcast. Now back to the show.
Well, so to step back a little bit, we, as a business, again, early 2000s, had to learn very quickly about the fire service, right? So I mentioned the white powders. That's a specific niche of hazmat and what we could approach with the technology. But you know, if you are, and I may use terms that aren't consistent with the UK, I'm US based, but like a first due engine team to an odor call, right? You're not a hazmat team. You're coming in with some basic monitoring. Maybe
it might be a volley. You know, we have a lot of on-call retain services in the UK with even less training with respect.
Exactly, right. So, but you're still doing air monitoring, and you mentioned the smell. The human olfactory system, not as good as a canine, but it's pretty darn good at picking things up. So again, we had to learn, well, what are all these signs and symptoms and information when you do this scene size up before we could realize where the technology, this higher technology, fits in, right? And we'll talk about air monitoring a little bit more because the technology I'm describing has recently gotten into the air monitoring space. But like, we thought early on, we have this great product. We want one on every fire engine. Wow. And then what we did is we talked to firefighters, you know, within the community, and we learned, no, that's not what's going to happen. So we had to learn.
Why? Okay, lack of appetite or lack of ignorance? No, we're very romantic about the job sometimes, where we go, no, we don't need that, Mark. I've got a good feel for this sort of stuff. Yeah, okay.
Well, what we learned, it's about mission space and what is your mission, and it's about training levels. You mentioned training. Are you awareness training, operational training, technical training level? So as a business, we had to sort of navigate this and then really focus on, and it comes down to hazmat, the area where the technology would be adopted most heavily. Right. And so that's kind of where you saw over the course of the next 3 years in the early 2000s, working with the right individuals, learning what their problems were. Then we designed another product that was more suited for the field. And over the course of time, that's gotten a lot better. But just focusing on the problems and trying to develop what you kind of refer to as purpose-built systems.
I was about to say, because you need to simplify it down a lot.
Right.
Because I would imagine, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the original application and design of this technology was as a scientific tool for analysis in research or for a very complex facility that had a dangerous substance and wanted to detect a leak of some form versus, with respect, like for me, a knuckle-dragging firefighter that needs to pick something up that's a bit like a smartphone and as resilient and easy to understand, hopefully, that just gives me a key. Because again, like you say, the expanding role of the first responders role map. Right. You know, we used to just fight fires. We were firefighters. Right. Now it's fire and rescue, but it's actually also fire and rescue and hazmat and investigation and education and water rescue and everything else, collapse structures and whatever else we keep throwing in the bucket. There's a real cognitive capacity in our ability to become remotely subject matter experts with respect in any of those fields. And this is a very complex field. So talk me through that, because also now I think it's exploding now. So like the use of these things in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, just something we spoke about before we came on. You wanted to learn a little bit about ways that we're using them. A big driver, I think, for a higher level of use of these is our focus on contamination. Yeah. You know, our focus on contamination, firefighter risk to the occupational hazard of cancer. You know, World Health Organization has declared it a carcinogenic profession. We're seeing a lot more in-cab detection stuff. We're seeing a lot more post-fire detection, whether that's around the crew that's just come out of the building and they're continuing to gas off, and is it safe for them to be there? In station, so in the appliance bays, in where the trucks are kept, we call them appliance bays in the UK, the level of contamination that's in there,
even your bunker gear. I mean, all those things that get contaminated, and you need
the idea of clean stations that are clean for contamination and red, green, and amber zones and all that sort of stuff. I think there's going to be an explosion of reliable technology that can give that assurance that you are in a safe. Because often with and again, I'm talking out my arse here, but you'll know a lot better than I will. A lot of the risk for me with airborne particulates and exposure is the chronic stuff. Right. Because you don't really feel an immediate effect. Like if I'm hanging out of a turntable ladder and I'm not wearing the harness, if I don't wear the harness and I fall out, I'm going to get some feedback pretty quick from the earth that was a big mistake. But with chronic exposures to gases specifically, you're not going to know until it's too late. And then it's oh, Jesus, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've never thought about that. And now I'm got a debilitating illness that's going to kill me slowly and get me out of the job. And they don't want to admit that it was part of the job, but I think it is, and no one really cares, and I'm just out of the job, basically, and going to reduce my life. I think there's going to be a real explosion. Could you take me down that rabbit hole for a second? Have you seen similar to that in the US? Do you see a demand in that part of the sector for this, just away from the operational side for a second?
Right. So on that tangent, the problem of prolonged exposure, as you described, the carcinogens that a firefighter or anyone who's exposed to these toxic materials over time, it's something we as a business are acutely aware of and are learning more about. And can the technology we develop contribute to that? There's another side of it on the firefighter side and just their operational side and adoption of technologies within that community. So it's not a case where we can say, hey, we got this new device. It can detect all these things and keep you safe. You would think, obviously you want that, but it's a more complex scenario than that, certainly in the US. So it's something we as a business are aware of. So, we can cover the acute hazards, right? And we talked about the white powders, and we can talk more about some of those other evolving threats that we can address. But these chronic hazards are something that we as a business are keeping a keen eye on it. And in the midst of talking with people in the community and just trying to see, is there a way the technology can help, not just keep you safe in the moment, but keep you alive for longer.
That's my fear is that there's a big political minefield around a lot of that as well, because you have to admit there's a problem, and then if you admit the problem, certainly in the US, there's a big litigation sort of environment. Might be a good opportunity to just unfold a little bit what we consider to be short, medium, and long-term exposures. Because I remember from my time doing some training with mines rescue over here, certainly in terms of carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide and things like that, decomposition of products in trenches and in mines and all that sort of stuff. What other lengths of exposure and times? Because there's like 4 hours, 8 hours and beyond. How are these things categorized? I know there might be a difference in UK legislation to international. I don't know. But what do we consider when something becomes a chronic exposure versus... Because like with gas monitors, often we just walk around with the one on our hip, and if it makes a noise, walk in the opposite direction until it stops making a noise. But usually it's making a noise, and you could actually probably exist in that environment for another 8 hours and you wouldn't really notice it. Either like carbon monoxide, you might get a bit of a headache. But it's understanding the differences there. There's probably a question in that somewhere around lengths of exposures to things. How do you quantify them?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and so we use various metrics for any given product. And I always say everything's toxic. It's all about the dose.
They say the poison's in the dose, don't they? Yeah.
Right. So if you think of the acute exposure, the typical one we refer to is the IDLH, the immediately dangerous to life and health. Okay. And that's a value that basically says if you're exposed to this concentration, By the way, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm just familiar with operationally how these are used. But within the very short amount of time, you can become very ill or possibly succumb to asphyxiation, whatever it is. So that's the IDLH, and that's where we have traditionally been focused, again, on the acute hazards and making sure our technologies can detect at or below those levels. Now, you talk about exposures, there's other metrics like the STEL, the short-term exposure limit. And then there's the PEL, the permissible exposure limit. And in the U.S., OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they sort of define these terms, and it's really for worker safety. So if you're working in a chemical plant, the permissible exposure limit, I believe, is an 8-hour period, and you can't.
Similar to us in terms of the Management of Health and Safety at Work
Yes.
Act regulations or legislation.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So that's how we quantify those, and use those levels to ideally make sure that in the case of a chemical plant worker, they're not exposed. But in the case of a responder, now the discussion we're on here is, okay, how do we make sure the responders over time responding to these fires, and in post-fire, there's so many carcinogens from all the different products of combustion, that can technology allow us to make sure that they are within a safe environment. And one thing I've learned too is after a fire, and I could be wrong here, but the first thing a firefighter wants to do is get that mask off, get out of that SCBA. And
because you're usually pushing it right to the limit anyway.
Right. Because I understand. But
this is where we're actually really bad in hazmat. So when we go through like dry decon or interim decontamination, if we've been in a gas tight suit or whatever, you're supposed to leave like a 15-minute air capacity. And people listening around the UK, they might have slightly longer times than that. But that doesn't give you a lot of time actually in the incident itself, and pushing that a bit too far.
Right.
Problem is we always do it in training scenarios. Very, very little do we actually do it in reality. And you think to yourself, you can't just pull that off halfway through decontamination. Because that's basically a fail. You might as well have never worn it. And you've got to leave enough time to, like you say, to go through those decontamination processes. Because just ripping it off, defeats the object of it.
Right. So yeah, like you mentioned, decontamination, verification, monitoring atmospheres during overhaul, and all those areas are what we as a business are really focusing on, because we feel we're continue to do this, but have addressed the acute hazards. And I'll just say this, Pete. So going back to the history of the technology, and I kind of alluded to how it got adopted within the hazmat community. So that company, Sensor Technologies, did that. In parallel, in the early 2000s, another group of very bright scientists, engineers, and business people started a company called Ahura Scientific. They developed a different type of solid liquid identification technology, and the two companies were competitors. Over the course of time, as usually happens, small startup gets purchased by a big company. Few of the smart people take their winnings, start another company, and you see the process.
Yep.
But what happened in April of last year is, in April of last year, the company I was with, out of the lineage of that first group at Sensor Technologies, was acquired by the 908 Devices, which was out of the lineage of that other group. And now basically what we have is, I'm biased, I'll be honest, but I think probably the greatest and most capable group of really smart people together now as one, who can now attack the problems you and I are discussing.
A team of Avengers. Yeah, because I imagine these are smaller markets than if you're in the weapons market, or even in the, for like firefighting specific, if you're in the branches and hoses market. So combining all of that, collective knowledge and experience, I imagine is quite a formidable set of individuals now.
It is. And the other thing about just the evolution, so it's one thing, the technology, right? Technology and capabilities for manufacturing smaller devices, for example. Algorithm developments, artificial intelligence, all these buzzwords that I'm sure people are aware of. That's all evolved. The other thing is, bottom line, we just know a lot more about people like you and about firefighters. And not even that. We've branched out into law enforcement, where the customs agencies.
Well, 100%, mate. I often think when we talk about decontamination, we forget about our paramedics and our police officers and everyone else that is on scene. You mentioned about post-fire, haul over and turnover, damping down, as we would call it here, or even fire investigation officers. Historically, they never used to carry anything because the fire's out, and you have this assumption the hazard is now gone.
Right.
And the level of exposure, that is significantly worse for fire investigators who are turning up just as the crew have got topside of it and they've started their external investigation, and then once it's not so hot, they'll head inside and start doing some preliminary looks and stuff like that. But historically, they would never wear any, SCBA, any breathing apparatus. And I think that's why some of the biggest damage is done.
I'm glad you brought up fire investigation, Pete, because it's an area that I'm just starting to learn about, and we as a business are. And specifically a subset of fire investigation being arson investigation. And, what I personally have learned and our business has over the last almost year now, working with some external partners, is, to your point, the limited technology that they use going on to a scene after overhaul. Canines are typically the technology of
for
choice.
detection of accelerants and stuff like that. We'll send the dogs in. Yeah.
Ignitable liquid residues, things like that. Problem is, canines are mammals, and canines also get sick. And this is something I've learned, that...
you know what? I'd never thought about that.
Yeah.
You know what? We
so there is
humans
a
are
desire
beasts,
with...
though. We
there is a desire within a segment of that community to get away from canines and use technology, because you don't want your dogs getting sick and dying from cancer.
We don't, but unfortunately, with the military, it is actually an asset. And I've got 3 dogs. Don't get me wrong, I love dogs. But as I say, we humans are wretched beasts. The way we treat animals, and I've owned horses and dogs and stuff like that, the more and more I become a little bit uncomfortable about what we're doing.
Yeah. And again, I say it's a segment of that community that's sort of interested in sort of exploring how technology can be used in the case of arson investigation for the ignitable liquid residues. And so we're working on that actively, again, to see if...
Smaller market locally, perhaps, in terms of just one nation, or certainly out in the UK. But we have regional assets and international fire investigation teams that go up and down the UK, because each service doesn't necessarily have their own. And there's 40-something services in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. So they will share these individuals and the canine units as national assets. But that team, is a fantastic team to be marketing it to. And there will be those teams all over the world.
Right.
So, depending on how large you can go, there is obviously a market for it. And I think certainly for that community that see the tremendous value and time they invest in those animals, aside from simply the moral humanitarian aspect of what are we doing to these animals that we say we care about, and they're just as much of a member of the team as anybody else. Okay. Would you send human in to do that? No.
Right.
So why are you doing it to the dog?
Right, exactly.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents, and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
And even apart from that piece, looking to see if there's a better alternative to canines, we talked about money. Look, these devices, these high-tech devices are not cheap. right? Compared to just some very simple pH paper or something else that teams will use. So to the extent like a fire agency or a brigade who has their fire investigation unit within, that they can further justify procurement of technology for other applications. That's, again, this is what we're learning. But at the end of the day, what we are trying to do as a business is not just build boxes that we think are cool and sell them. We're really trying to address problems and find solutions that are going to help not just fire services, again, law enforcement, customs agencies, the military for sure. That's a whole other beast.
Aviation is quite a big sector, I'm learning. Like, and I don't know if this is something you've explored before, but through the work I've done with particulates and contamination, jet fuel, apparently there's something incredibly unique about that and how small a particulate it is and all this sort of jazz, and the level of contamination that is around airports. Apparently it's tremendous. And I don't know if you have any knowledge or exploring it. We can sharp left turn off this subject if it's not of any relevance. But do you know much about that? I'm led to believe that is becoming recognised as a thing. Is they don't sit within government. Like all of the fire brigades and fire services in the UK work for the government, whereas all of our airport fire services is owned by private companies.
Right.
So they don't sit in the same thing. You know, they don't get protection from the same unions. They don't.
Right.
It's different. But my limited understanding is there's tremendous contamination risk there.
It's a great question, Pete. And I'll be honest, on the jet fuel and the exhaust and contamination to that extent, that's not something I've considered. Now, we have installed systems, technologies with fire services that support airports, but more for, again, there's a spill in the terminal and they got to figure out what it is. So again, more those acute hazards. So it's an interesting point you bring up that quite honestly, I haven't considered, but might have to.
It's only, we did a big contamination seminar recently at Biggin Hill Airport, which is a private airport in the UK. And we had services from all around the UK come and talk about firefighter cancer. And there was a toxicologist there. And that discussion came up as it had given rise to things that are more common in their workplace that none of us had ever thought about.
Right.
But anyway, stick a pin in that for a future rabbit hole for you and your team to maybe wander down. What is actually hurting us? Let's circle back to turning over, and spectroscopy or whatever the mechanism that we're using for detection. What are the main things that are most likely to cause that chronic hazard and health debilitating effect on our first responders when they go in? What are the things that we should typically be looking out for? The things that pop up on these detection units that we should be giving more concern to?
Right. In terms of chronic exposure, so certainly there are the toxic products of combustion, hydrogen cyanide, formaldehyde, these various very small gaseous things that come off when you burn foam or any of the other numerous types of synthetic materials in a structure that burn in a structure fire.
Vehicle fires are ones that concern me. The cocktail of substances that go into making a vehicle. Horrific. I remember when I started my career, not really wearing breathing apparatus, putting out a car fire. And my God, the toxins that come off them, it's horrific.
Especially electric cars. And
we'll get into hydrogen fluoride in a little bit because I know very little about that, even though I've spoken to a few UK experts and they talk about this cloud of hydrogen fluoride and acrolein. And I want let's stick a pin in that for a second.
Got it.
Take me back to structure fires, and then we'll build onto that in the future, perhaps, because it's something I'm very interested in.
Yeah. So it's those small molecules. Again, the cyanide, formaldehyde. There's a whole litany of others. Nice thing about gases is they go up. If you give them enough time, they go up and get infinitely diluted in the atmosphere.
Some are heavier than air, though, aren't they?
Well, gases are lighter. So vapors, vapors are heavier than air. And there's this handful of gases that can be heavier. But for the most part, they go up. And
because that is a very layman's term for me. When we say lighter than air, the thing when Pete says air, what he's actually saying is also a cocktail of individual. Air isn't just a thing. Depends where you are and what you do. For layman's terms for my firefighter mindset, air in itself is not all air is the same, is it?
Well, so we simplify things, and in terms of what stuff weighs, we generally say air weighs 30. Air is mostly nitrogen and 20% oxygen, and then a few other things. So that number 30, in terms of its weight, is kind of the benchmark.
What's that measured? Is molecular
weight?
Molecular weight. Okay, it's 30.
You take the nitrogen, what it weighs, and then you scale it with the oxygen, what it weighs, and so forth. We use the number 30 as sort of the rule of thumb.
And this molecular weight up that we're just going to use as a framework for this next part of our conversation, I'm assuming that scales all the way up to solids and beyond, does it?
Yeah. So everything, every product, every chemical has some molecular weight. And it's based on the way it's put together with the different atoms and what they weigh.
I do remember some of this from my Institute of Fire Engineers. Yeah. And I'm really stretching back into the cognitive warehouse to try and stick with you on this, but let's keep going. So the molecular weight of things. Yep.
So let's use a simple one, water.
Okay.
Water is H2O. All right. Oxygen weighs 16. How do I know that? On my wall in my office, you can't see, is a periodic table. I can look at it and say it weighs 16. Anyone can do that. That's the chemist's cheat sheet.
Yeah.
Hydrogen weighs 1. There's 2 of them. So 16 plus 2 is 18. So water weighs 18. Okay. And that's what we mean by molecular weight. In the case of air, you're right, it's a mixture. But we take nitrogen.
So that makes easy sense. Yeah. As we heat up water, we reduce its weight, it separates out, and then it gets lighter and lighter, becomes air, gets rid of the vapor, all that sort of jazz. I'm sure I fumbled my way through that.
Unfortunately, I use water as the example because it's always the exception. It does weigh 18.
Yeah.
But it's a vapor that's lighter than air. All their vapors are heavier than air. They sink, right? But water is 18. But what happens if you put a glass of water out on the table, you come back the next day, what happens? It's evaporated, and it eventually goes up into the sky and forms a cloud, and then eventually comes back down as liquid. And but vapors are heavier in air, and then gases, most part, lighter. So it all comes down to that fundamental chemistry of how much they.
So in terms of hazard areas and fears of long-term exposures, if most gases, effectively anything that's going to come up on one of our gas detectors is less of a concern, because people talk about contamination clouds when we go to incidents and wind direction and and all that sort of jazz. But with certain things, and this is why I own I've got a little piece of paper in one of my incident command packs that I hold in my bunker pocket of my leggings. And it has some things I've just got above the line and below the line, lighter than air, heavier than air.
Oh, I know that.
On it.
Yep.
Because I try and go, well, I'm less worried about this one affecting that crowd over there 200 meters away, because this is going to go to atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure. That wasn't given to me. I just sort of wrote that down. I'm not sure how reliable it is.
Well, look, anyone who's been in a chemistry lab, they always have fume hoods. And what's the purpose of a fume hood? When you're working with gases and vapors, it just sucks it out. In certain cases, they'll have scrubbers or things depending on what they're working with. But the bottom line is the solution to pollution is dilution. Just put it up in the atmosphere. So again, the gases and vapors, there are some that are very acutely toxic. We have monitors for that. But going back to the question about chronic, to me, in what I'm learning and understanding in our businesses is it's more about the particulates. And again, these little tiny pieces, and in the U.S., the Environmental Protection Agency has guidelines in terms of what size of particles are respirable, right? What can you breathe in, but they just come back out, and then what sizes will get stuck in your lungs. And if you think about particles that maybe are like polyaromatic hydrocarbons, so that pH
is this like the origin of asbestos, where that started?
Asbestos is an interesting one, Pete. You know
Okay.
why? Asbestos, as a chemical, is not toxic. It's basically
No.
just a silicate.
Yeah, we always say like, if it's in the walls or if it's in concrete, or you could, people used to say, "Oh, how stupid we were. We used to have it in our clothes," and I'm like, "Yeah, but you're not going to eat it,
Right.
so don't worry about it."
But it's all about route of exposure. So you breathe in some tiny
This is part of the
fibers
PFAS conversation I think that's going on, and we're not going to go here. This is my words, not yours. But like, there's a big thing in the States at the minute, and it's bled its way over into the UK. That it's in
Right.
some fire suits. It's in our clothing, and I'm like, we care about it in the foam that we used to use. But like, and these are my words, not yours. You haven't got to give your professional opinion on this. But like, when people say, "Oh, it's in your fire suit, it's going to give you cancer," I'm like, only if you eat it, and you have to eat like loads of it. And that's not to say I'm not worried about it. And I know nothing about nothing. But from the people that I speak to and my limited interpretation, I try and dilute it down to 7-year-old language. And I'm like,
Sure.
I'm not going to breathe it in, and I'm not going to eat it. And I appreciate our skin is the biggest organ in the body, and it absorbs everything, and blah 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 blah. And epidemiologists will be, not that any are listening, but they'll roll their eyes and go, "Stupid boy, what are you saying?" But like, a lot of this stuff you can't absorb it. You've got to breathe it in, haven't you?
That's right. And again, another aspect there is we look at phases. We're talking about gases and vapors. Talk about particles. Those are solids or liquids that are suspended. But something like a pile of a powder, as long as you don't touch it, like I said, as long as you don't eat it, your isolation zone can just be a few feet. Because powders don't give off vapors. I mean, there are a handful that sublime and give off some things that smell, but for the most part, it's about understanding how will it hurt you, right? And like you said, if there are carcinogens on your gear, as long as you're not licking your turnouts, but over time, if you're patting in and you're breathing stuff in when you're not in SCBA, that's where the concern is. And I think this is something we're all just trying to wrap our heads around.
So take me back, because I did the constant thing I do, which when I'm excited speaking to a knowledgeable academic like you, I interrupt all the goddamn time. I'm sorry, it's my ADHD. What's hurting us when we're talking about turning over, damping down, fire scene? Let's narrow it down to structure fires predominantly now. What should our equipment be detecting? What levels of it is harming us, and what is actually harming us?
So, as far as chemical classes, I mentioned the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, as they're called, and there's a whole class of those. And anything, just think of it this way, a burning couch, right? So it's a lot of it's going to burn, it's going to give off toxic gases and vapors, but there's also probably particles of nylon or polyester or whatever your couch of choice is made of. And again, when they're particles, I don't know so much, and this is Mark talking, so I'm not talking as an expert on this, that it's the chemical effect. Again, it goes back to asbestos. It's the fact that these particles of whatever are breathed in. And getting them on your skin is not the issue from prolonged exposure. It's the mucous membranes, it's inhalation. So I don't know that it's so much a chemical issue, but in terms of detecting, we want to be able to not just do particle counting. We do want to be able to say there are particles in this air. Oh, and by the way, their chemical composition is, again, whether it's a polymer type of fiber or type of material, or it's some PAH, or whatever type of toxic substance might be suspended, because then you go beyond understanding the particulate issue and understanding the chemical piece and how we can potentially treat that. Again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think the more we understand about the nature of those post-fire hazards, the more we can, make policies and just provide treatments that are appropriate. I say all this, again, that this is something we're continually trying to learn about and explore as a business and as a community.
Hard left turn, just because it's something that I noted from our earlier correspondence. When you're involved with some of the studies and evolution of safety tools surrounding anthrax. Wicked. Because anthrax is always one of those black magic conversations where people go, oh, there's been an anthrax letter delivered to a government building in the area and now we're turning out the hazmat. What is anthrax?
Yeah.
Why do we care? This is not stupid questions, but well, they might seem it to other people, but just so we're capturing everybody in this conversation, not just the hazmat experts. What is it? Why do we care? Is it still a hazard today? Is it still as prolific as it once was? When did you start getting involved with that work? And why did it become such a part of our vernacular? Right.
So first of all, anthrax, so I got to geek out for a second, is Bacillus anthracis. That's the Latin
That's what I had
term.
written down as well.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, it's a bug. It's a bug that exists as what's called a spore, meaning it's encased in this.
So it's a living organism.
Yeah. Well,
the germ.
It's a bacteria.
Bacteria. Yeah.
Okay, or bacterium versus a virus. And what that means is the anthrax in its little comfy case, its spore, can exist in the environment for a long time. It exists naturally in like cattle fields. It's just something that's within the ground. So it's there. Now, why is it we have to worry about it? Because it can exist and sit and be happy, and sure, there's ways of decontaminating it, but if it's just sitting in an envelope or just out in the environment and then we breathe it in, now we've given that little spore, that little bug, a place to grow. We're basically the incubator.
Yep.
Okay. And then it can do its thing, multiply, and generate its toxins. And then that's
What does it do to us?
So
how do we die from it?
So I don't know the specific biochemical mechanism. Okay. But it produces a toxin that just interferes with our respiratory system. Okay. And as I understand it, I'm going to clarify, as I understand it, it's basically you give us a very serious respiratory infection.
Like COPD.
Depending on your comorbidities.
You get lots of scarring on the lungs and eventually we might die or something, I'm guessing.
So the other thing
about it, because that was the big fear with asbestos, wasn't it? It was all of the respiratory issues that it caused people.
Right.
But obviously that was particulate that just damaged and scarred the lungs.
Right.
It wasn't a living organism. It just, I think, the small needles of asbestos, wasn't it? It's that scratches and scars and damages the lungs to the extent, and the alveoli and all that jazz. And then you just
whereas a bug like anthrax, it's growing inside you and it's producing these toxins, which is interfering with metabolic pathways and just doing things to really make you sick. However,
that's got a shorter path to game over, I think, than
what's that?
Than others.
Yeah.
So take me on to. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that. And with anthrax or any bug, any of that type of biological infection, there's an onset time. You don't get sick right away. So going back to the white powder issues, if you see a white powder, you think there's anthrax. Yeah, number one, don't breathe it. You touch it, you wash your hands with cold soap and water, fine. But if you're exposed, you won't know for a while. And that's why Cipro was the antidote way back in those early days. I forget the name of the pharmaceutical company that came out with it, but Cipro was what a lot of agencies carried that you could take and it would prevent that growth. So it's a latent effect.
Like the morning after pill for anthrax, basically.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. And then
probably just as much of a lifetime commitment if you get the illness as well. Not that children.
And then, if I may, just kind of jump ahead so anthrax has not been discussed, not been in the news. Problem with anthrax, it's kind of hard to grow and make and get it into a weaponizable format.
I'm struggling. I've been trying for ages.
It's kind of a pain in the neck. What would you rather have if you wanted to influence some harm and terror? Something you could get very easily, that's highly toxic, and that is acutely going to cause harm. Now we look at the fentanyl scourge.
MSA is supporting us on today's podcast, and I chose to partner with them because I've been wearing this stuff for nearly 20 years, and they are the global leader in development, manufacture, and supply of incredible, safe products that really protect people, not just our communities out there, but also first responders, most importantly, all over the world. Get yourself over to MSA and have a look at it. The high-performance protective clothing for emergency services responders. They also partner with us on the UK Pink Firefighters. It's because we love them. The helmets with the reflective visor, the F1XF, absolutely epic helmet. And not forgetting how they improve firefighter safety through their connectivity in the connected firefighter platform. MSA are always pushing the envelope, and it's a real privilege to be able to continue to grow our partnership together. So whether it's your PPE, your bunker gear, your helmets, your SCBA, your thermal imaging, your Luna, or your portable gas detection, both of us know that this equipment needs to work. It needs to be high quality, reliable, and dependable in the moment. And that's why I use MSA, because they know what's at stake. What is fentanyl? Because I hear this on loads of different podcasts about it being maliciously included in various products by God knows who, other countries perhaps, or again a bit big in people that take recreational drugs. I understand it's a tremendous threat.
Yep.
Is there an actual application for fentanyl? Why does that exist?
Yeah. So if you go back many years ago, fentanyl, first of all, it's a synthetic opioid. So there are opiates, like heroin is an opiate. Heroin, though, you have to grow. It's a plant. You grow the poppy plants and you have to harvest it. Okay. But it's in that class of compounds, but it's synthetic, so it's man-made in a lab. Okay. And it was developed many years ago as an aesthetic and an analgesic for chronic pain and for surgeries, legitimate medical use, and it's still used today. If you're someone in surgical ICU, maybe had tremendous brain trauma and surgery, you're going to be on a fentanyl drip. So it has legitimate uses. Even like cancer patients who have chronic pain, they have patches that are available to put on your arm and to get you that slow dose. But over the course of time, people who are into drug manufacturing, illicit drug manufacturing, realized, hey, this stuff's very potent. It's much more potent than heroin, and we don't have to grow it. We can just make it in a lab. And then it's a heck of a lot cheaper. And then we don't have to put as much into our pills. So as a business model, if you're a cartel, it's great. I mean, I'm being facetious here, but you understand why the problem has become...
much more scalable. You can control it yourself. You haven't got to worry about growing anything and the long time scale involved in that.
Right. And then really on the streets, and it's largely a U.S. problem, and I've learned this, although we see it kind of migrating outside. But it's not so much that responders, firefighters, even law enforcement, who's the first that shows up when in the U.S. we call 911? That's how you call for emergency. It's a police officer. It's a patrol cop. And they show up and they see this stuff, and it's usually an overdose. So it's not a case where it was intentional. It's a case where someone had a bad experience, but now there's this powder that's got to be taken care of. We got to be able to identify it. Now hazmat teams are called in to support law enforcement to say, hey, what is this stuff and what do we do with it? And going back to the anthrax analogy, now you're looking at something, actually, if you do touch it over time, you can get exposure. As long as you're wearing gloves, and some basic personal protective equipment, you're okay. You breathe it though, that's a problem, and it's acutely toxic. So you can get sick right away versus again, anthrax, which takes days. And now remember with anthrax I mentioned the Cipro, which was the antidote. I liked your analogy of the morning after pill. So now it's all about Narcan.
I have to stop saying things like that. I'm not sure it's appropriate. Sorry.
Now it's all about naloxone, trade name Narcan, that is carried.
Yeah, I've heard of Narcan. Yeah, we use something else for post-surgical opioid in the UK. I can't remember what the bloody hell it is. I remember having it when I've had knee surgery and surgery on my chest. I can't remember what it is, but we have it in a drip. Anyway.
But Narcan is that magic antidote that if you take it right away, then it's going to block the receptors in your brain and then you'll come down. You still have to be taken care of medically. But my point is that the white powders of today now are, number one, acutely toxic. Number two, how many anthrax actual letters were there? There's like 2.
Yeah.
If you look at the rate, how many white powder calls were there versus how many anthrax? How many were anthrax?
Yeah.
Now today, how many white powder calls are there, and how many are synthetic opioids? The numbers are just outrageous.
Thousands.
Do you see how the threat landscape has changed?
Yeah, 100%. So that's maybe a good segue. Before we came on speaking today, I gave a quick rundown of my limited knowledge. Although I worked at a station for about 4 years where we had a detection, identification, and monitoring unit, which is a national resilience asset. And within that, we were always told, hey, this has got millions of pounds of gear on it. It doesn't belong to you. Just take it to the scene. If something bad happens, and some experts will turn up and they'll use it. We help them set it up. And then they do scratch and sniff and lick and taste tests. Obviously they don't. But they do all the silly stuff. And on there was this, so I'm led to believe, very archaic piece of equipment, the Hazmat ID unit, which we were always told, and I don't know, fire service. You put something under that and it logs into a system in America that holds millions of data around. I don't know what it does. It already had the old internet dial-up with the silly noises. It ran off Microsoft XP or something like that. I think it still does. That no one's making the stuff anymore, so they can't update it. They just need to buy another one, which is £100,000 or something. I don't know, probably more. So talk to me a little bit around within that white powder conversation. We turn up, see something's been discarded by the side of the road usually, and they go, oh, it's an unknown white powder, or it's an ICE, individual chemical exposure powder incident. We turn up, okay, it's one of them. Call the thing, everyone stands around, put a cordon in place, and we wait for somebody to turn up, put a suit on and go in there, take a sample, do a sample. What is that technology? Because there's 2 things as well. There's one that does that.
Right.
I think that one is spectrometry, isn't it? Where it spins it through something really fast, explodes it, and then analyzes it or something. The guy that explained it to me, it was a bit like, we're going to shoot something down a pipe and then we're going to hit it with a baseball bat at the end. And when it explodes, we're going to look at what it's made up of. Firefighter explanation. What's actually happening? And how are we detecting what's in a white powder?
Yeah. So first of all, the Hazmat ID, very familiar with that, was on the project team that developed it. And it was designed to replace that travel IR system, that first FTIR infrared that I mentioned way back in the early 2000s. But really, here's what it does. Okay. So every chemical, water, you name it, that has certain types of structure, the way it's put together, if you shine heat onto it, so infrared radiation is nothing more than heat, then some parts of that infrared will actually interact with the chemical. I call it kind of tickling the bonds.
They'll vibrate sooner, depending on
vibrate.
their molecular makeup, because they're more respondent to that heat radiation. Yeah,
and basically what happens is you have the infrared, you put the sample in the way, and the sample essentially casts a shadow, an infrared shadow, onto what we call the detector. And that shadow is basically a fingerprint. So it's completely analogous to if someone is arrested, okay, and they are taken to the station and fingerprinted, right? That fingerprint is very unique to that individual, the shape of all the lines and the patterns, right?
Then it's just pattern recognition to what is this most likely.
And then you take that and you search it against the database, and if that individual had been fingerprinted before, then you say, oh, this is Joe Smith. We've identified that person, that suspect. So that's the library. So the way it works is the responder, the operator in the field, takes a pile of the powder or a goop of the liquid, whatever it is. They put it onto the device, which has a sensor that you just place it directly on top of it. And then within the device, it's recording that infrared shadow, that fingerprint, and then comparing it to the large database where people like our company and others around the world have measured chemical suspects, thousands, tens of thousands of them.
Yeah.
And so it all happens on board. Yeah, there is some wireless connectivity within the Hazmat ID, and that's another area where over time field devices have improved and evolved to enhance what they can do with wireless. But it's all on board, and it's really just doing that fingerprint and giving you a result of, hey, we think this chemical is acetonitrile or whatever the chemical from the library is.
What's the most up-to-date version of that technology now?
Yeah.
Because do people still make Hazmat IDs? Do you make them? Like, are they still...
The Hazmat ID it was discontinued, and that just happens. Because over time, the parts become obsolete and all that. But so at 908 Devices, and actually RedWave technology that was acquired by 908 Devices last year, as I discussed, developed a product called the Threat ID. And they really developed and designed it to have a similar form factor. It's like a little briefcase type thing for operators who really like the Hazmat ID, but couldn't get it serviced anymore. Again, it's end of life. So the Threat ID is the latest evolution of that. But in parallel, what you've seen in the market are even smaller, more handheld infrared devices for solids and liquids, and thermoscientific, based on what Ahura had developed years ago. They have a version, and then
I was going to say, because I imagine as long as it can hold the power source, whatever the power source is, you're just putting something in under a clamp and a hammer and putting it under exposure.
Yeah. And the other thing we've done, when I say we, the industry, trying to keep things simple. It's interesting, Pete. I've never read a spec sheet of any device in the world that doesn't say its software is easy to use.
Yeah. I was told that about half the platforms I use for podcasting, and I'm still knuckle dragging, banging my head against the wall of, God, I can't use this stuff.
Easy to use, intuitive software. And one thing that we always try to keep in mind is, look, unless you're a dedicated hazmat team, and they're few and far between, you're a fire agency hazmat team, guess what else you do most of your time? You put out fires.
Yeah. Like you get this off once every few months, if that. I mean, if it's a white powder, you might get it off more regularly, but still, your interaction with this thing is so low for you to develop any form of expertise with it.
So what you see now is really just push this button, boop, put your stuff here, boop, and give me a result that means something to me. So that has evolved over time, going back to the Hazmat IT. So, because again, you can get trained all you want. You can sit through an 8-hour training of any device. But like you said, if you don't use it for another month, and you have all these other trainings you're doing, and it's
skills fade. Yeah, hemorrhages fast.
And I've also heard that once you put on a SCBA or a suit, you lose like 30 IQ points. That's what I've been told. I don't know if that's true.
Well, I think it provokes our masculine hero mindset as well, and everything becomes a little bit more agricultural and a little bit more primitive in our movements. I wanted to pull that pin out of EV. I wanted to cycle back there before I lose it out of my mental whiteboard and it falls off the edge. Gas clouds. Thermal runaway, EVs. What's happening? What is the gas that... Because this is the one... I was speaking with a UK expert a little while ago, Professor Paul Christensen, who is a big UK lead in electric vehicles and lithium-ion battery technology.
Right.
And we talk a lot about... it's like word games. Like you say lithium-ion, people think it's synonymous with EVs, electric vehicle. Hey. Well, no, it's everywhere. It's laptop, it's phone, it's everything. And my bigger concern is battery energy storage systems inside homes.
Right.
Because if an electric vehicle has a little wobble and you go, oh God, stay away from that, but it's over there on the road, don't worry about it, leave it alone. Right. If one goes off in a ferry or a train or an aeroplane or wherever in a sealed capsule, or worse than this, my bigger concern is you turn up at a property on the tip sheet, which is the call out information that comes through to our crews, pull it off, the drive out, and it says light smoke issuing from within the property, no signs of heat or fire. So you go, okay, probably a small fire inside someone's house. We'll go and have a look. I go there. I use my thermal imaging camera. No heat at the window. I can see some light wispy gas inside. Tell you what, stick some BA on anyway, and let's go in and ventilate the property and just try and find out what it is. 4 seconds later, bang, the whole front of the house comes off.
Right.
Because we don't know what this gas is. We didn't think it would be anything like that because we're so conditioned into smoke is fire.
Right.
And wispy smoke is a very ventilated fire. It's not thick and black and acrid. It's not, doesn't look angry. We're down regulating our risk immediately in our heads. Most of us probably. Talk to me about what's coming off lithium ion batteries. Why is it toxic to us? How toxic is it? Because again, taking the conversation back to vehicles, someone's trapped in a vehicle, something starts gassing off.
Right.
Well, it looks like it's going in that direction anyway. I'm not too worried about it. Hold your breath. We'll try and get you out as quickly as we can. Unfold a little bit of that. Take that question in any direction you choose.
Yeah. So, with lithium-ion batteries, like you said, they're everywhere. And I know talking with firefighters, certainly here in the U.S., and learning about this problem, you go to a fire at, let's say, 2 a.m., you have to assume that every phone, every device, everything in the house is fully charged. Maybe
the vape thing, the electric scooter in the hallway, the car outside, the laptop, the phone, the hair, everything. Yeah.
So the state of charge of lithium-ion battery has a significant impact on how bad the boom is. And I know this because I've done some work using more high-end thermal imaging, but looking at the heat produced and the radius of blast, all that. So state of charge is a big one. The other thing is, like you mentioned, the wispy smoke. Once you see that wispy smoke, you can't stop it. Thermal runaway occurs. It's a chain reaction. Yeah. Whether it's a cell phone or whether it's like an electric bike battery that you have plugged into the wall.
They're the ones we've had in the UK. Some famous cases of e-scooters on charge in high-rise buildings and people jumping out of buildings.
And then the problem is, and I'll address what toxic gas is. We'll talk about that, but just to kind of framework the entire thing is, so best solution to avoid this is having a proper battery management system. So whether it's a battery for an electric bike, whether it's your battery system in your car, or your home for charging your car, even your cell phone. The battery management system is what sort of makes sure that the cells, the lithium ions, don't get overcharged and potentially have a thermal event. And they sort of keep track of that. Those are pretty standard, or are standard, with manufacturer supplied, again, e-bike batteries and their chargers, all the things we described, even for your cell phone. Problem is, someone, their EV bike is losing charge and they go on eBay and get one that's maybe been refurbished. And then maybe they're plugging it in, or even like your cell phone. I'm sure we've all gone by a service station.
I don't want to buy a new £2,000 iPhone. I'll just see if I can get one and just try and do something with the battery and make it work.
But even the charger, you go to the gas station and get a cheap charger. It doesn't have that battery, that brick you plug in. So those were the problems come in. And I
think that's a lot of the issues as well with international purchases. You're purchasing something online that doesn't adhere to the regular, because electricity in the UK is delivered differently to how it's delivered around the world. Right. And using things that don't adhere to the same, and again, I'll get all the terminology wrong, but the same regulations, EU regulations, whatever it might be, in terms of energy supply, draw, delivery, and that's where you get all that overheating of phones under pillows and all that jazz.
Exactly. I blew up a coffee pot at a hotel in the UK, even though I had my little travel, not just adapter, but like voltage converter, and it just didn't like it. So, you got to be wary of buying things from overseas.
You know what? It's one segue, sorry, before you carry on. I was speaking to someone to do with national threat and intelligence a little while ago, and they were saying this is one of their big growing concerns. Is, like you've said, I think the tolerance is something like it doesn't let the battery go below 20% and doesn't let it go above 80. I'm probably wrong there, but let's use that as a framework. But it will look like it says 80% is 100%. That's what it looks like to you.
Right.
But if you've got 10 electric vehicles on charge underneath a government building, and their computer system, for simplistic terms, is what tells it don't charge above 80. A cyber threat is you going into that system and taking the lid off it and just letting it continue to charge. And then you've got 10 bombs underneath a government building that are vulnerable to a cyber threat. Again, not your area of expertise, but it's something that just when I heard it, I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
What a vulnerability. And I'm sure there's lots of systems that protect us from that. But you can log in. I've got an electric car. It's like a driving cell phone. I can log into it now and switch it on, start it up, set the heat in, all that sort of jazz. So I'm assuming you can access the information. It can tell me its mileage. It can tell me the latest journeys it's done, blah, 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 blah. I would imagine you can get through that if you know what you're doing. And I don't know anything about anything. But anyway, total segue.
It's okay. If you learned anything about hackers is, you just mentioned if you know what you're doing, they like to figure out how to do it. So
they're amazing problem solvers. Oh my God. Yeah, for better and for worse. Technology is very much the Pandora's box, isn't it? We're not putting it back in there. Take me back to the gases. So it goes to thermal runaway, gives off gases. What's happening? Why should I care? Is it going to kill me? It is beyond a privilege to be able to bring the Firefighters podcast to you, and we are so grateful for every single person that supports, listens, shares, and follows our journey. But here's the honest truth. It takes a colossal amount of time and work to keep the podcast going. And to help us keep doing it, create more, reach more guests internationally, and make the podcast sustainable, we're asking for you to help. And to do this, we've set up a Patreon page. Now, by joining this, you'll not only support the future of the podcast, but also gain access to exclusive benefits. Now, if you've ever wanted to meet a member of the podcast, buy us a beer, buy us a coffee, and you think anything you've ever listened to on the podcast has been worth £3, that's basically what we're asking you for. By joining our Patreon community, you will get access to every single full episode archive we have ever made. Now, hundreds and hundreds of key documents that we've got in there on fire behavior, firefighter health, cancer risks, instant debriefs, and so much more. A growing collection of valuable resources to help you learn and grow. Your support in whatever way, dropping it in the WhatsApp group, sharing it on the local newsletter, whatever it is, it's incredibly valuable and we really do support it. And we need it to make it a long-lasting resource, that legacy resource we always talk about for first responders, firefighters, and everybody everywhere who's ever been interested in joining the fire service. Now, if you're already supporting something, as many people do, it's totally cool. You can still access the podcast for free and you'll always be able to access all the new episodes for free. But we're asking for your help to make this sustainable. And we want to keep growing, we want to keep sharing the insights, and we want to keep showcasing the incredible work happening in our community and our sector. So if you feel like you want to join the Patreon crew and help us make this possible, head to patreon.com/TFFPC or check the link in any episode podcast notes.
Well, the biggest one, as I understand it, is hydrogen fluoride, HF. Yeah. HF is what we call one of those angry gases.
Very toxic, very corrosive.
Very toxic. You get HF into your system, it can cause a lot of problems very quickly, and its toxicity level is very low. I mentioned everything's toxic. It's about the dose. You don't need much of a dose of HF. Fortunately, it's a gas, and like any other gas, like I said, the way to mitigate is to vent it. You don't try to capture gases. You vent them and don't breathe them in. So I don't know the exact concentrations that are produced. I think it depends on the cell. We're talking about
I imagine they vary due to manufacturing and all that
fire. And there's other toxins as well. We actually have done some work with our infrared devices to see what we can detect under these controlled, explosions and sampling. Unfortunately, in the infrared, HF, even though it's very toxic, the other thing about infrared technology is it matters how well the chemical likes to interact with the infrared. And some things like to do it really well, and some things don't. So we're just not very sensitive to them. And so these are things we're trying to investigate. But there are certainly some other less toxic gases, some just organic fumes and things
But
of that.
ultimately, so there's acrolein in there as well, which I
Yes.
believe isn't toxic. I think that's just an irritant of some form, isn't it? Or is
Well,
it
when I
toxic?
say toxic, again,
It's the dose. Yeah.
it can do something if you're exposed to it long enough that will cause a problem, not necessarily death, but is a problem.
But hydrogen fluoride, and again, these are my words, not yours, but you stick a load of positive pressure ventilation fans on. Again, I know it's emitting at quite a high volume, and the volume of gas and the velocity of that gas is coming out of these cells quite aggressively. But given enough ventilation, it will go to atmosphere.
Yeah.
But in the immediate vicinity, what is the hydrogen fluoride explosive as well? Which one is the one that makes it go bang really fast? Because these vapor clouds are explosive.
Right. I don't believe hydrogen fluoride itself, and when I say explosive, it's about flammability.
Yes.
The ability to burn. But again, a lot of these other gases and vapors certainly have flammability characteristics. So, the explosion itself is based on the thermal runaway within the cell and the chemistry that's occurring, and then that chain reaction that's just causing it to go boom. But yeah, then these other gases that are being and it depends on the environment too. You mentioned 10 electric cars in a parking garage. Well, now you're talking about essentially a confined space. Not fully confined, but versus electric car out in an open parking lot. That's a whole different scenario, right? In terms of what you have to worry about.
Or even just one in a parking garage, something like that in somebody's home, because that's typically where they'll be charged.
Right.
That gassing off and just seeing small wispy smoke emitting from underneath the garage door.
Yeah.
Highly, highly toxic, way more so than standard gases that we could get away with. Like me as an incident commander, if I go to a property, it's issuing smoke out the front door, I'll probably still get down low, poke my head in and have a look, because sometimes casualties are right near the exit point and you can try and make a snatch rescue or something like that. But if I do that with hydrogen fluoride, that might be one of the last silly decisions I make.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the best technology for HF is fluorine paper. Simple paper.
Really?
That's what, where you basically, it's like, so you have pH paper, which tells you if something is caustic,
Potential
corrosive,
hydrogen,
right?
and how acidic or alkali it is.
Fluorine paper will just tell you if there's fluoride present. And I know that certainly in the U.S., a lot of responders, when they go in on their initial reconnaissance, right, do that site survey, they're going to have fluorine paper as well as a oxidizer paper and pH and your basic monitors, and that's going to tell you right away if you're in that HF environment. So
they have that in a monitoring device.
It's just paper.
Yeah, I know, but is that something you would have to replenish after the incident? Is this something you take out? But is it single use like pH paper is?
It's single use, yeah.
So how are they taking that in then? Because I've never seen it. I mean, I've seen it on our. I've seen pH papers on our units that we use to test fluids.
Yep.
Never something that a responding crew would take in with them as a first attack. Unless people are listening to this going, Pete, you've completely forgot about this thing. I'm pretty bloody confident we don't have anything that we would take in with us. When we have little mobile gas detection units. Again, that I said before, they only pick up 4 or 5 gases. So these are taking something in with them. This is a handheld monitoring device.
So specifically for papers, there's different approaches that I know various agencies will use. One of the common ones is to use what's called a bear claw. So imagine you have this probe, this stick, and on the end of it is a set of clips, like 5 clips or so. And you'll take your different papers, pH, oxidizer paper to look for oxidizers, again, fluorine. You can even use papers that can pick up like M8 paper, which is used for chemical warfare agents. Anyway, you put these on this little clip, and it's pretty rudimentary, but sometimes that's the best way to do things. Typically, they'll have a set that is wet and then a set that is dry, because depending on the gas, you may or may not pick it up if it's dry versus wet. And they'll use that along with their multi-gas detector, right, which is looking for flammability levels, for oxygen suppression or depletion, and a handful of other toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide as part of that first entry suite. So that bear claw is a common one.
So if they're tipped out to an incident that is unknown odor emitting from X property or X location,
right,
whatever, that will be and they're carried on most frontline appliances. And again, I know I'm asking you here, difficult. There's a million fire services in the fire brigades departments in the US. I've not seen one of them. Interesting.
Yeah.
Useful.
Yeah.
Because we're walking in a little bit blind at the minute, to be honest.
And the whole idea of that recon is to what are the things that are going to kill me, right?
What level of PPE do I need before I go in there? Yeah.
Right. So radiation, obviously, we're not talking about that here, but you got to look for that gamma radiation, flammability, toxicity, and then oxygen suppression, depletion. You want to look if it's confined space.
Yeah.
So that's what they're trying to do is assess, and like you said, okay, rule out certain hazards, figure out what other equipment we would need and what PPE is appropriate to proceed. So some pretty simple stuff, but it's life-saving.
Yeah. All of the stuff has usually been existing for a bloody long time, where it just takes so long for us to catch up in the first responder sector. I don't know why. I think it's because there's not a lot of money in it. I think, in the military, I think stuff moves a lot faster. But in first responders, we get the dregs of technology from, and I say that with respect to companies like yours, but we're usually 10, 15 years down the line of innovation because...
right, you get the hand-me-down.
We just realise what our brothers and sisters are doing in other sectors and go, oh, that might be useful for us because we've got nothing for that.
Again, go back to the mine safety, the use of the detectors for flammability in mines and confined spaces. And that's technology still used today in emergency response. So yeah, using the hand-me-downs and being creative.
Confined space work. This was always a typical one that was always brought up when we're talking about air detection and air monitoring. So when I've done work in urban search and rescue, collapsed structures and build-up of toxic gases in confined spaces when you're trying to carry out a rescue in a confined space, something like that. One of the typical examples, case study that was always given, is the scenario of farmer descends into a silage unit, usually full of chicken poo or animal feces of some form. He's gone down there, lost consciousness, don't know. Second person's gone down to see why Bob has collapsed. Second person goes down. Yep. Then they ring the emergency services and go, oh my God, 2 people have gone down into this thing. We lower down some form of gas detection. Tells us nothing. Because often with stuff like that, the substance has to be disrupted, doesn't it? So, I mean, I'm dropping little clues out there. I know this is a very simplistic, maybe chemical composition to speak about. But in terms of what we're exposing ourselves to in trenches, confined spaces, decomposition of natural materials. Because when people go, oh, chemical incident, they're like, oh, it's anthrax or it's this or it's that. A lot of this stuff is around us just through the natural decomposition of
biological material,
biological matter. Yeah. What's happening there? Why should we care? What's hurting us?
Yeah. So you're certainly getting some hydrogen sulfide and those types of compounds just through the decomposition process. Yeah, that's why the sewer gas, it's
hydrogen sulfide. Yeah. Toxic, asphyxiant. What is it?
It's very toxic. It's highly toxic. It's immediately dangerous to life and health level. The IDLH. It's like a 100.
Can you recover from it if you're brought out of it, or?
It's just if you aren't pulled out of that, and I don't know the root as far as what it does biochemically, but it's highly toxic. And so you want to make sure that's why detectors that are used for it detect it well below those levels, fractions of the IDLH level. So that's one. Then you have methane. So methane isn't necessarily toxic biologically, but I think as we all know, especially in a confined space, now you have a flammability explosion
Very
hazard.
flammable, explosive, yeah.
So those are the two biggies.
When we talk about upper and lower explosive limits,
Yeah.
Unpick that one a bit for me, because again, I know it's some incredibly simplistic stuff, but I'm going to say for all firefighters, not just new firefighters, talk to me about richness and flammability and ranges and why I can't throw a match on diesel, as an example.
Yeah. So yeah, we have these two metrics: the lower explosive limit and the upper explosive limit that we call the LEL and the UEL. And there's a range depending on the gas, and it really varies depending on its behavior and how well it wants to burn. Of course, as I'm sure all your listeners know, you need three things to have a fire. You need the fuel, which is the gas we're talking about. You need oxygen, and then some form of ignition source, something to start it. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about, you mentioned being rich or lean, depending on the gas and how much oxygen it needs to have that combustion reaction occur, that will define the minimum amount that it needs with the amount of oxygen. And then when you get up so hot, so at the UEL and then, the LEL, and then when you get up to the UEL, where you're basically oxygen lean and just not enough, where you won't have a burn occur. Mm-hmm. So, and that range can be very wide. It ranges from 0 to 100%. It can be as low as close to 0 up to 100%. It could be very narrow, that flammability range. But that's really what we're talking about. Is it has to do with the combustion reaction that occurs, and that's all burning is. It's the chemical reacting with oxygen and forming a new thing, and it has to do with the ratios, what we call in chemistry the stoichiometry, but really how much oxygen is needed to make this thing burn. So really, to summarize, the UEL or LEL and UEL give us a good sense of what concentrations of this stuff should we worry about potentially being causing a flammable or explosive environment. I always like to define flammable as things that are burning. Combustible is, so flammable is gases and vapors. Burning, combustible has to do with the flash point, but it's the liquids. Explosion to me means we have this process occurring in a container, and now we have a deflagration. So we use these terms explosive limit, but it really has to do with flammability.
Deflagration was always the word I couldn't get off the lips. It seems quite a clunky word.
Don't ask me to do it again. I did it once.
We talk about that with boiling liquid, expanding vapor explosions and deflagration of gas, bodies of gas and all this sort of stuff. Oxyacetylene is always something is always a trigger word in our minds when we go into industrial estates and stuff in the UK, because my understanding, extraordinarily volatile gas. Very, very, very easily flammable and things like that. When we go to domestic properties, this is probably the more typical uses of gas detection in the UK. When we go into a domestic premises, someone's complaining of their carbon monoxide alarm keeps pinging away. Talk to me a little bit about carbon monoxide. Why do we care? How dangerous is it? Is the house going to explode? What's the ranges and stuff like that?
So carbon monoxide, the real issue with that is the toxicity, because I want to say it's immediately dangerous to life and health level is something like 10 parts per million. I could be wrong, but it's very low. And what happens with carbon monoxide, it's not that we're worried about flammability, it's that if we breathe it in, what happens is that CO molecule binds with the hemoglobin, the iron in our blood, our red blood cells, and that prevents them from taking up oxygen. So we essentially die from asphyxiation, if you will, because now our blood can't take up oxygen. It's reversible, fresh air, if you get to it in time. But that's why we design these residential CO detectors to alert at very low levels, and even err on the side of false positives, just to be safe. Everyone's had a CO detector go off, and the fire department comes out with their monitor. Nothing here. Rather be safe than sorry. But it's how it attacks the iron in your blood is the concern there.
Very early on in my career, and I'm going to probably get some of this wrong, but I was educated around the dangers of open fires in terms of when we go to chimney fires, it's caught something in the flue, we put it out, and you almost get that reverse stack effect with cold air outside, and then after you've left the property and everything's out and everything's cold, all of that carbon monoxide that then dumps back into the living room where this person lives.
Right.
And there's incidents of fatalities post-fire because of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Right. Yeah, and the problem with carbon monoxide is you can't smell it. It's odorless. Obviously, you can't see it. So,
I think that's what led to a lot of the proliferation of carbon monoxide detectors around the UK. We give them for free in the organisation that I work with. We go and fit them in people's properties and stuff like that. But because typically, people are using their fires when it's cold. So as soon as we leave, they close all the windows, and all that carbon monoxide starts dumping into the living quarters of this home.
And the next thing you know, you're passed out and
game over. Yeah, it's that real invisible killer. I want to be respectful of our time. We've been talking for well over an hour already.
Yeah.
This is just an element I'm so fascinated with. There's so much we could go into. What is the most productive use of the remaining sort of 15, 20 minutes of our time? Because I want to be respectful of your time, but there's such a raft of things, the 908 devices, but also just you yourself, areas of study. What stones do we want to turn over for the time that we've got remaining, or elements that you are seeing as growing areas of interest in the first responder community?
Well, that's a good question, Pete. And as you were asking it, I was thinking of a topic that I was mulling over prior to our chat here, and it has to do with the bigger concept of, in terms of hazardous materials response and toxicities, of bulk versus trace. And over the last few years since we've been in this business, we've had to learn, especially with the evolution of these much more highly toxic threats out in the world, like fentanyl and opioids, that even hazmat teams, fire service agencies have had to sort of adopt a whole new paradigm in terms of worrying about things at very small, tiny levels. I learned way beginning of my career that, and this is just what a firefighter told me, so this isn't my words, but to a firefighter, a little amount is less than 55 gallons. Okay. I'm a scientist, so to me, little amount is microliters, nanoliters. So it's all
very different when you speak to environment agencies. Yeah. Whenever we report a leak to them, they're like, if it is, because we said, anything over 20 liters, I think, which is like a bucket I think holds 20 liters. We're not really, obviously we speak about liters and milliliters in the UK. But they said, no, if it's something like, my brain's going to escape me. I'm a brain fart. It's, they use them on farms. If it's, some agents that they use in agriculture, it's not herbicides. Something else,
like
pesticides, yeah. Or something they're like, if you just get a few hundred milliliters of that in a local watercourse, that can kill miles of rivers,
right?
And I was like, oh wow. So they're like, it doesn't matter what it is, just inform the environment agency as soon as it goes into the ground, because even if it doesn't go directly into a watercourse, we talk about source pathway receptors when it comes to the pathway of contamination to the environment. It might be going into, under the ground. They have water mapping of where everything is actually flowing. Right. But yeah, sorry for my interruption and segue there, but you're right. Like even the small doses of things,
right,
is incredible.
So yeah, you see this shift in the response protocols, even because there's a need to address these minute levels, and not even minute levels like invisible amounts. We all have been through the airport, whether at Heathrow or wherever I fly out of in the U.S., and they swab your bag. They're looking for tiny invisible amounts. But it really has to do with a big bulk pile of stuff that's got tiny amounts. Like you're talking about pesticides in water. It's a tiny amount, but it's enough to be harmful. And I call it the needle in the haystack problem, where you're trying to find that little thing. And so it's not enough just to be able to say on a response call, oh, this stuff is something innocuous, it's harmless, it's baking soda. But what if lurking therein is something very dangerous? So, trace technologies and the ability to detect at these low levels, and just operationally doing trace sampling. And again, firefighters who used to, pulling lines and hundreds of gallons a minute of water at a time, and now you're talking about doing tiny little tests in the field. Yeah. It's something we've really had to, as an industry, wrap our heads around, because it's the problem we have to address. So the general concept of bulk versus trace, and how I've and my colleagues have seen that it's still happening, that mind shift in the response community to say, we need to worry about this, and we need to make sure we're prepared to handle these types of things.
Do you
the 55-gallon drum analogy kind of doesn't really hold anymore?
Without my conspiratorial head, saying if you start opening up that can of worms in the trace chemicals that we are exposing ourselves to, and we're exposing our first responders and our operators to, I pessimistically feel that our overlords will be less interested in us knowing the dangers we're placing ourselves to, and the dangers that are facing the public.
Right.
Because these are often problems that will not be easily fixed. And especially like when you say things entering the environment.
Right.
God, you're chasing you're trying to chase the horse after it's bolted in that circumstance. And it's more of a, trying to mediate and mitigate the damage of this thing.
That's just what I was going to bring up, Pete, is really from the hazmat side of the house. What's the ultimate goal, objective on an incident? It's to mitigate. Yeah. They're not worried. The fire service hazmat team isn't worried about the environmental aspects and things like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency would worry about. But how do we contain this stuff? How do we get it out of here? How do we mitigate? But sometimes
neutralize it perhaps as well.
Right, exactly. But then you got to know what decon solution to use, right? You got to know what the process is. And so that's where I was going, is just understanding that to do the mitigation properly, and again, it goes to PPE selection, you want to make sure you're aware of all the potential acute hazards that might be present.
Mate, I found that absolutely fascinating. I would be remiss because I know, listening back to this myself, or even certainly people listening to it, they'll be like, oh, I can't believe you didn't ask more about this. Can't believe you didn't go in that direction. I'm sure this could very easily grow into a 4-hour conversation with my relentless side corridors and rabbit holes that I could drag you down into. If people want to find out a bit more information, we're going to put some links below here, most probably to A, your LinkedIn, B, to 908 Devices. But if people want to learn a little bit more about some of the topics we've discussed today, what are the biggest areas of professional interest and or solutions that you and the team can help support the first responder community in if they want to learn a little bit more about it?
Right. Well, one of the areas in which we are very active, not just in the U.S., is going to training conferences and being present there, delivering workshops. We do them all over the world, certainly a lot in the U.S. Those are good opportunities.
Can you do them virtually?
We actually do webinars as well. Cool. So chances to interact with people like myself and my colleagues, to ask the burning questions, as it were. So that's certainly one avenue. But clearly on our website, 908devices.com, there's a lot of information there and links to resources to kind of point in directions. And I would just encourage the listeners and anyone in this field to certainly listen to and view this podcast. Look for others. There's a lot of great information. Some maybe not so great, but just to get the perspective of the people like you, the responders.
Awareness is a fantastic tool because it's there's such a subtle difference between the obvious and the oblivious.
Yeah.
It's that whole Johari's window, the unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know. And I think that's a lot of the case when we look back at some of the reasons some of the legislations have come in, some of the health and safety and advances in personal protection. They say science and technology and safety advances one death at a time, unfortunately, and it really does. A lot of this stuff, a lot of this is written in blood because someone has already had to pay the ultimate cost, and only through education and awareness, through people such as yourself and others, can we hopefully not repeat those errors of the past. So
exactly.
Thank you so much for your time, brother. I really, really do appreciate it. Send my love to all of the team, to all of the family. Appreciation to Katie, that people won't know, who has supported our connection and my terrible time management. So total transparency, a big thanks to Katie on that one. And I hope to do some more work together in the future, mate. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Pete. It's been fun, bud.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Hope you took a lot away from that episode. We started the Firefighters podcast to develop, inspire, connect, motivate, represent, and most importantly, celebrate the world of incredible emergency services operators and the wider sector through this series of wide-ranging conversations. We really love creating this podcast and bringing it to so many people. Did you know you can also find these on YouTube? We do a lot of video podcasts now. You can head over to our YouTube page and follow, subscribe there. And as a final ask from us, whatever platform you're on, please rate the podcast. It really helps us as a key performance indicator to reach more and more people. I've been your host, Pete Wakefield. This has been the Firefighters Podcast. And wherever you are in the world, please stay safe, be happy, live with intention, and where possible, please remember and support your firefighters and first responders. I'll see you next time.